930 AD. Thingvellir, Iceland. The Alþingi has assembled. Several thousand people gathered on a volcanic plain in the Icelandic summer. Farmers, warriors, traders, women, children. The entire free population gathered for the assembly that would determine the legal reality of their society for another year. And at the center of the assembly, standing on the law rock, is one man, the law speaker. He is about to do something that no other legal official in any other medieval civilization was required to do. He is about to recite the entire Icelandic legal code from memory. Not summarize it, not refer to written notes, not read from a document, recite it. Every law, every provision, every precedent, every formula for every legal situation developed in the 60 years since settlement. From memory, aloud, so that every person in the assembly could hear it. Because the law only existed if people knew it, and the only way people knew it was if someone said it out loud. Every year. The law speaker's recitation took 3 years to complete. He recited 1/3 of the legal code at each Alþingi. Over 3 years, the entire code was spoken. Then he began again, a single human mind carrying the legal infrastructure of an entire civilization, not as a curiosity, not as a backup for written records, as the primary storage medium. Because the Norse had made a specific decision about knowledge. They had decided to carry it in people, not in documents, in people. And the consequences of that decision are the story of how the Viking Age thought. To understand the Norse knowledge system, you need to understand what writing was in the 9th century, not what we think writing is, what it actually was. In 900 AD, writing in Western Europe was primarily a monastic technology. Books, manuscripts, were produced by monks in scriptoria. Expensive, time-consuming, requiring specific materials, parchment made from animal skin, iron gall ink, the physical infrastructure of a scriptorium, that a Norse farmstead or longship simply did not have. The literacy that writing required was not widespread, not in the Norse world, not anywhere in medieval Europe outside the church and specific administrative contexts. Writing was not a general technology. It was a specialist tool, used by specialists, for specialist purposes. The Norse had their own writing system, runes, the runic alphabet, the elder Futhark, later modified into the younger Futhark used across the Viking Age, was not a system designed for extended text. Look at the physical context of runic inscriptions. Stone, wood, metal, bone, all of them hard surfaces. All of them surfaces that require a cutting tool rather than a brush or pen. All of them surfaces on which the effort required per character is significantly greater than on parchment. You do not write long texts on stone with a chisel. You write short texts, messages, names, commemorations, ownership marks, specific ritual formulas. Runic inscriptions are almost never extended prose. They are almost always brief. Functional, a word that says, "This belongs to X." A sentence that says, "Y raised this stone in memory of Z who died in the East." A formula that says, "May this protect its wearer." The Norse did not use runes to write down their legal codes. They did not use runes to write down their navigational knowledge. They did not use runes to write down their medical knowledge, or their shipbuilding techniques, or their farming practices, or the 1,000 other systems that constituted their civilization. They carried all of that in something runes could not hold, the human voice, and the human memory that fed it. The skald, the Norse word for a poet, a professional poet, a person whose social function, whose entire value to the community, was the composition, memorization, and performance of verse. Not decorative verse, not entertainment in the modern sense of entertainment, functional verse. The skaldic tradition was the Norse information technology. A skald composed verse about real events, real people, real decisions made by real leaders. The elaborate kennings, the dense alliterative structures, the complex metrical patterns were not aesthetic choices. They were mnemonic technologies. A kenning, a compound poetic formula that substitutes a descriptive phrase for a simple noun, sounds decorative. The sea called the whale road, a sword called the wound snake, a battle called the clash of shields. But each kenning, once learned, is an error correction mechanism. In oral transmission, in the passing of verse from one memory to another across generations, errors accumulate, words change, phrases drift. The specific content begins to shift away from the original. The kenning structure resists this, because kennings are fixed formulas, combinations that the tradition had established, and that any competent practitioner would recognize and correct. If you hear a verse in which the kenning for the sea has been changed, the whale road becoming something else, you know the verse is corrupted. The kenning is the error flag. The alliterative structure serves the same function. Specific sounds in specific positions, a structure that any practitioner recognizes instantly, any deviation from which signals corruption, and the complex meter, the syllabic patterns that define each line, is the third layer of error correction. 3 independent systems, each capable of detecting corruption combined in every line of every serious skaldic verse. The skaldic tradition was not poetry as we understand poetry. It was a data storage and error correction system, built from sound and memory, designed to transmit information across generations with fidelity that written transmission could not reliably provide. In a world where manuscripts were rare, fragile, and frequently destroyed, the memory techniques the Norse used to carry this knowledge are not mysterious. They are documented, and they map onto what modern memory science has independently established as the most effective approaches to long-term retention of large amounts of information. Narrative embedding. Information is far more reliably retained when it is embedded in narrative, in a story with characters, events, causation, and emotional content. The Norse did not memorize laws as lists. They memorized stories in which the laws were demonstrated. A saga about a specific legal dispute, the offense, the assembly where it was adjudicated, contained the legal principle at its heart. You could forget a legal principle. You could not forget the story of Gunnar standing at the ship watching his farm and turning back. And Gunnar's story contained the legal principle, what outlawry meant and what it required of the community, in a form the memory could retrieve. Emotional encoding. Memory is dramatically improved by emotional engagement. Information attached to fear, admiration, or sorrow is retained longer and more reliably. Skaldic verse was composed specifically to produce emotional response. The best verse about a battle was not the most accurate factual account. It was the account that made the listener feel the battle, that made them afraid, that made them proud, that made them feel the specific quality of drengskaper, the worthy action, that the verse was celebrating. The emotion was part of the storage. The law speaker reciting the legal code was not reciting a dry list. He was performing. The performance, the cadence, the formulas, the specific verbal art of the recitation created emotional engagement in the audience, which meant the audience retained more of what they heard, which was the point. The knowledge was not just transmitted, it was absorbed, physically learned, embodied. The medical knowledge that Norse healers carried was not a list of which plants treated which conditions. It was years of apprenticeship, years of working alongside an experienced healer, years of handling the plants, preparing the preparations. The knowledge lived in the hands, in the specific movements of preparation, in the sensory memory of what the right preparation smelled like. Written instructions could not transmit this. Only direct apprenticeship could. And the navigational knowledge that allowed Norse sailors to cross the North Atlantic without instruments was not a set of directions. It was years of accumulated sensory experience, the specific feel of the current, the appearance of the cloud formation that indicated ice shelf, the specific behavior of specific bird species at specific distances from specific types of coast, all of it embedded in a human nervous system, not transferable through text, only through presence, through the shared experience of master and apprentice, both reading the same ocean. The knowledge was the person, not the document, the person. Here is the catastrophic vulnerability of a knowledge system built on people. People die. The law speaker who carries the legal code in his memory can be killed. The navigator who knows the current patterns of the North Atlantic can drown. The healer who carries generations of medical knowledge can die in an epidemic. The skald who has memorized the histories of a dozen noble families can be lost at sea. And when the person dies, the knowledge dies with them. Not partially, not gradually, completely. In a single moment. The transition from Norse paganism to Christianity in Scandinavia, which occurred across the 10th and 11th centuries, was not just a religious change. It was an information catastrophe. The knowledge systems were embedded in the religious and social structures of Norse paganism. The völva, the seeress, the keeper of specific types of knowledge, practiced within a pagan ritual framework. When that framework was suppressed, the völva's practice became not just unofficial, but actively persecuted. The knowledge she carried began to disappear. The skaldic tradition continued for a time after conversion, but the religious knowledge embedded in the verse became increasingly opaque, and then lost. The Norse oral tradition was not destroyed by conversion. It was made unintelligible. The knowledge was still there, in formulas, in specific patterns, but the living tradition that gave the patterns meaning was gone, and without context, the patterns were noise. Beautiful noise, but noise. The Icelandic manuscript tradition, scholars writing down fragments before they were lost, preserved the Eddas, the sagas, and the legal texts, preserved by Christian monasticism, writing, the technology the Norse had not used, that had displaced the oral culture that produced them. The written record we now use to reconstruct Viking Age culture was made by people who had already lost most of it. What we have is a fraction of a fraction. The knowledge that could be written down, which was not the knowledge that lived in hands and voices and nervous systems. That knowledge is gone. The currents the navigator felt, the preparation the healer's hands knew, gone, because the people who carried it are gone. And no document can hold what a person holds. In 1222, an Icelandic scholar named Snorri Sturluson sat down to write. He was writing a manual for young poets who wanted to practice skaldic verse. But to write the manual, he had to explain the mythology, because skaldic verse was built on the mythology. The kennings could not be understood without understanding the stories they referenced. The sea was the whale road, because of what whales meant in Norse cosmology. The gold was Fafnir's bed because of the story of Fafnir the dragon. The warrior was the feeder of ravens because of what ravens meant in Norse theology. Without the mythology, the kennings were just words. So Snorri wrote down the mythology, in a work now called the Prose Edda, the most comprehensive account of Norse mythology ever assembled, written by a 13th century Christian Icelandic scholar, who was also a politician, a historian, and a poet, who was writing down something he knew was disappearing, not because anyone asked him to, because he understood what disappearing knowledge costs. Snorri had access to the oral tradition in its late, partially degraded form. He had access to written sources, the verse collections, the legal texts, the earlier Icelandic manuscripts. He had access to living practitioners of the skaldic tradition who were among the last generation for whom it was still alive. He pulled everything together. He organized it, contextualized it, explained it, made it legible, and he wrote it down. Not all of it, not the parts that lived in hands and voices, but the framework, the stories, the names, the cosmology, the mythological context that made the verse intelligible. He saved what could be saved, with a technology that the people who had created what he was saving had not used. The irony is complete. The Norse oral tradition was preserved by the written tradition that displaced it. The knowledge carried in voices was saved by the technology of the culture that had silenced those voices. Think about Snorri, writing in 1222, knowing the tradition was already mostly gone, that the people who had carried it in the full, living, embodied way were dead, that what he was making was not the thing itself. It was a shadow of the thing itself, the best shadow he could make. We read his shadow today, and through it we see dimly what the tradition was, the cosmology of a people who believed in gods who could die, the legal framework of a civilization, the navigational knowledge of sailors who read the ocean with their bodies, the medical tradition of healers, all of it filtered through a 13th century Christian scholar's attempt to preserve what was already almost gone. Snorri was killed in 1241, in his own home, by political enemies. The man who had preserved more of the Norse oral tradition than anyone else died violently, in Iceland, in a political dispute. The tradition he had written down survived him. The manuscript was copied and recopied across centuries, and eventually reached us. We know what we know because Snorri sat down in 1222 and wrote. Because he understood that knowledge without a vessel disappears. And he was the vessel, the last adequate one. Doing what every person who carries irreplaceable knowledge eventually has to decide: pass it on, in whatever form the passing is still possible, before there is no one left to receive it.